Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the executive director here at the Harvard Law School Library. I'm really delighted to have you all join us here for our book talk, Felony and the Guilty Mind in Medieval England. I'd like to thank the Dean's Office for co-hosting with us and providing lunch, the program in Law and History, and the Standing Committee on Medieval Studies, who also helped to sponsor this event today. Please continue to enjoy your lunch during the talk. The books are on sale outside of the room after our talk if you want to grab a copy if you don't have one already. So I'm delighted to introduce Elizabeth Papp Kamali, who's an assistant professor of law here at the law school. Who is clearly well-loved. She teaches criminal law and English legal history. Her research focuses on medieval English common law and the history of criminal law, with a particular interest in the early criminal trial jury. Her current projects include studies of the role of criminal intent in 13th and 14th century English felony cases, medieval understandings of anger's operation in felony adjudication, conflict between urban customary law and the English common law in the early 14th century, and the influence of Roman law on the early development of the common law. She completed her PhD in history at the University of Michigan and received her BA and JD magna cum laude from Harvard. Between college and law school, she worked at Orion Consultants, where she advised Wall Street broker-dealers on their relationships with institutional investors. I believe your medieval background probably helped there. She also volunteered as a court-appointed special advocate for children in foster care. She's joined today by Charles Donahue, the Paul A. Freund Professor of Law here at the law school, Intisar Robb, who's a professor of law and a professor of history and the faculty director of the program in Islamic law here at Harvard, and Nicholas Watson, the Henry B. and Ann M. Cabot Professor of English Literature, also here at Harvard. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you to the Law Library and June Casey for organizing this event, and to Professors Robb, Watson, and Donahue for being here today. And thank you to all the students and colleagues and friends that I see in the audience today. I'd like to open my comments, as I do my book, with an excerpt from an early 14th century poem, The Outlaw's Song of Trailbastion. You who are indicted, I counsel you, come to me, to the green forest of Belregard, where there is no lawsuit, nothing but the savage beast and the pleasant shade, for too uncertain is the common law. For one accused of felony in medieval England, the common law was indeed uncertain or doubtful. At trial, a defendant's fate, a walk to the gallows or a walk home, resided in the hands of 12 local men sworn to speak the truth, verum dicere, to give a verdict about the alleged crime. A walk to the gallows or a walk home. Faced with such possibilities, one can see why the poem's outlaw chose the shady woods of Belregard and the risks of life on the run. The one who can save me is the son of Mary, reflected the outlaw, for I was not culpable, but was indicted through envy. So this outlaw put his faith in Jesus, the son of Mary. Now in hindsight, which admittedly is never 20/20 when dealing with medieval records, we might think that the outlaw should have had a little more faith in the system. Most medieval English felony juries acquitted, and many other defendants secured pardons. Admittedly, that knowledge, had it been available to our outlaw, would have been small comfort if he had witnessed a gallows scene in his lifetime, or had known a family left impoverished after a parent's felony conviction led to forfeiture of their worldly possessions. Now, with some regret, let's leave the forest of Belregard behind us for the moment and move on to the comparatively perilous scene of felony trials. Felony trials in medieval England were perfunctory, with few procedural protections for defendants. The law was ill-defined, with no statutes providing an elemental description of particular substantive crimes. Defendants had no counsel, and if found guilty by a jury of their peers, they were likely to meet their end at the gallows. If it sounds grim to you, it should. Medieval English felony law was brutal. And yet, there were escape valves built into the system. A literate man might claim benefit of clergy to transfer his case to a church court where the death penalty was off the table. A fleet-footed alleged felon might run to the nearest church and take sanctuary, and might then confess to a crime and walk to the nearest seaport to enter exile abroad. For those who did make it to trial, as I mentioned, they were likely to be acquitted. The conviction rate was quite low. And many received pardons, a second chance at life. Now, why was this so? Why were there so many acquittals and pardons? And I'll note that this is a trial record from a session of jail delivery in the early 14th century. The central claim of my book is that the medieval English system of felony adjudication, a system based on trial by jury, had at its core an understanding of culpability situated in the heart and mind as opposed to merely the hands of the person who committed an allegedly criminal act. Mens rea, or guilty mind, constituted the foundation of medieval English criminal liability. And this was true despite the fact that medieval English felony law was in other ways unforgivably brutal. So why did mind matter? Mind, which was inseparable from heart in the medieval Western European worldview, mattered because the culture of the period, the 13th into the 14th century, was steeped in an understanding of guilt based on intentionality. Now, in England, jury trial for felony arose after 1215 due to the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church, which effectively abolished trial by ordeal by forbidding priests from participating in the procedure. The Fourth Lateran Council also mandated that all Christians make confession annually to their parish priests. So jury trial for felony took root during an age of penitential literature, which encouraged deep reflection on the nature of sin. And the centrality of mind to weighing guilt arises in the theological texts that informed the sermons jurors heard at church and the advice they received during confession. This theme appears repeatedly in a diverse range of registers and in Middle English, Latin, and Anglo-Norman French texts alike. Now, why might my book draw upon Aquinas and Chaucer, upon theology and literature in thinking about medieval English law? In general, peering beyond the legal record enables the legal historian to hypothesize about many of the mysteries yet unsolved behind the early common law system of felony adjudication, particularly with regard to the black box of jury verdicts and how jurors understood what they were doing in sorting the guilty from the innocent. My book, for example, looks to non-legal texts to understand how jurors understood the meaning of the word felony itself. Felony was derived from the Latin fel, for gallbladder, the gallbladder being associated with bitterness and wickedness in medieval humoral theory. Words of felony were used in literary texts to describe wicked characters, like Judas, who betrayed Christ, or Herod, who was implicated in the slaughter of the innocents. But what can we glean from the legal records themselves, from things like the trial records that I showed you a moment ago with all the acquittals and the occasional conviction or pardon? How was felony understood within these legal records? Because many cases end in a bald acquittal or conviction, meaning in many cases the trial record says very little about why a jury reached a verdict, I take the via negativa in my book to try to understand what counted as felony. I discern the meaning of felony by focusing on what jurors found not to be felonious. In such cases, the trial narrative sometimes says a little more about why something did not amount to felony. Now, given the fact that the insanity defense is before the Supreme Court this term in Collar v. Kansas, I thought I'd begin with an example touching upon that issue. In a mid-14th century case, John, son of William, was indicted for arson. He allegedly burned down another man's house. A local jury determined that John was a lunatic who was vexed by the sickness of dementia 3 or 4 times a year. And he was acutely afflicted by that illness for 8 days before and after the alleged arson, having no awareness or discretion of good or evil or of his own deeds. He was acquitted. And we find in some self-defense cases that some end in an acquittal, some end in a pardon, they don't end in conviction or in the gallows, a trip to the gallows. Now, in trial records, felony is also used in opposition to misadventure or accident. In a 14th century Northamptonshire case, for example, we hear about how William Wodreve, who was casting the penny stone with other men, and this appears to be a game involving tossing heavy rocks. I can't imagine what could go wrong there. So William was casting the penny stone, and he inadvertently struck and killed a 7-year-old boy named Walter, who had suddenly crossed the line of the goals. Now, according to the jury, William had indeed killed the child, but not out of any felony or any other malice aforethought, nor of any desire or will to harm him. The death was instead purely accidental, and William secured a pardon. Felony also seems to have demanded the absence of necessity and the unimpeded exercise of a person's volitional faculty or will. So, for example, a married woman might be excused of felony if she committed a homicide, for instance, with her husband, but could argue that she had acted under the command of her husband. The most frequently discussed example of necessity in trial records are examples of self-defense. Now, in one of the 13th century treatises' more poetic passages, Bracton describes self-defense as an unavoidable necessity committed without premeditated hatred, but with sorrow of heart. Now, this idea of sorrow of heart appears frequently in contemporary literature, like this early 14th century poem by Robert Manning, where it connotes the appropriate demeanor for one seeking absolution for sin. So what I want to emphasize here, particularly for my criminal law students who just learned about self-defense doctrine today, we're not here in a world of stand your ground. Rather, we're in a world of retreat, where a person only employs deadly force when there is no other alternative, and in fact does so, if we can believe Bracton, with sorrow of heart. Now, many self-defense narratives emphasize states of mind, but what they emphasize is the deceased's wicked state of mind and the self-defender's lack of alternative measures. In a 1310 homicide case, Robert, son of John, was accused of slaying William, son of Henry Bishop. And here, the jury narrative uses strong adverbs to paint the deceased man's aggression against Robert and his father John in the utmost negative light. The incident apparently began with an argument over a dike raised by John, and the dispute quickly escalated into physical violence. The trial record describes, for example, how William, and William is the deceased, William assaulted John and struck him gravely with a spade, and how William then approached Robert, the son, and struck him ferociously as well. These hyperbolic adverbs left little doubt in the narrative that culpability resided with the deceased rather than with Robert, a clear self-defender who had also acted in defense of kin, and Robert received a royal pardon. So drawing upon cases like these, my book concludes that felony, when used in legal records, denoted a crime involving the presence of deliberation and forethought, the exercise of reason and free will, and the absence of necessity or chance. Moreover, even when employed in legal records, felony often conjured up an image of moral blameworthiness, sometimes rising to the level of wickedness or depravity. Now, I'll speak briefly about a couple of other themes in my book. So my book also explores the related issue of anger. Now, although anger was sometimes equated with insanity in describing the actions of a person acting out of blind rage, so you'll see the Middle English word woad or mad used to describe a person acting in a rage. Although it's used in concert with notions of insanity, anger was not treated as presumptively exculpatory in the way that insanity was. And I delve into literature of sermons and theological texts and popular literature to reveal that anger was understood to be a shameful character trait, one which a person should try to correct and not allow to form into a habit. Anger couldn't be completely condemned because there was evidence in the Bible that Jesus had acted angrily and God the Father has acted angrily, but nonetheless, the overarching message was one of restraint of anger, not the sort of message we get when provocation doctrine develops in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, my book takes issue with a longstanding historical narrative that argues in a sort of English exceptionalist framework, suggesting that England and continental Europe took completely different paths in the wake of the abolition of trial by ordeal, with England moving toward jury trial and continental Europe moving toward inquisitorial trials in which confessions were elicited through torture. Now, there is some truth to that. They did take different procedural paths, but I argue in my book that England was no stranger to torture, employing the practice of peine forte et dure to coerce defendants into consenting to jury trial. This was a procedure in which weights were placed on a person's body until they either consented to jury trial or died. I also argue that England made tremendous use of confessions, that confessions were not just used in continental criminal procedure, but was used widely in English felony procedure. A confession could be a direct route to the gallows. A confession could be a precursor to abjuring the realm. As I mentioned, you could take sanctuary and confess a crime and then walk to a port and leave England. Confession could serve as a precondition for turning king's evidence, for postponing one's own execution and hoping to reverse that death sentence by providing evidence against co-felons. And confession underlies some pleas of self-defense and duress, with the idea that a defendant could say, yes, I did it, but, and then explain why they had acted as they did. And in my final chapters, I return to the issue of mind, considering the state of mind not of defendants, but of judges and jurors, the state of mind that they were expected to bring to the process of judging. Now, the literature of this period places great emphasis on the dangers of judging one's neighbor, lest one find oneself subject to severe condemnation at the time of the last judgment. And judges and jurors were instructed to exercise mercy, to avoid anger, and to approach judging with humility and self-reflection, bearing in mind that one who is a sinner today might be a saint tomorrow. And I'm going to close on that image because I like that image, the image of the redemptive potential of human beings, as I eagerly await comments and questions. Thank you.
Do you have any idea what order we're going to do these in?
I don't know. I think any one of you can.
Why don't we do it the way it is on the program? I think you're first, I'm second. What, Nicholas, does that make sense?
Well, I want to thank Liz for writing this book and giving me the opportunity to review it, and for this talk and giving us all the opportunity to learn from her scholarship. It was really a pleasure to read. And what I thought I would do is key in on a few of the major points that Liz covers in her book and ask a few questions about it. And I'll do so with respect to studies that I've done in Islamic legal history or criminal law, which especially made this book of great interest to me, as it deals with the same topic in Europe that I'm looking at in the Islamic world at the time. So I take the book to look at the extent to which mens rea or intent guided jury decisions and help explain the uptick of acquittals in the 13th and 14th centuries on which she focuses, according to questions of not just of empathy and mercy, but looking at intent as a matter of rationality. On the sources, she extensively combines sources for, as we saw, law and law itself with literary sources, religious sources, and others that bring up with this insightful view that there's really no difference between them in the social, cultural, and institutional sensibilities of the time. One informed the other, especially in the mind of the ordinary juror. Legal canons or legal maxims also play a significant role, or one that stood out to me in reading it. They seem to be included in the various texts and are cited often enough to arise here between the two covers of this book. Looking at all of these sources together, it seems to be the equivalent of intellectual, social history gathered by looking at all of the salient sources such that we can put ourselves in the mind of the 13th or 14th century judge or juror. So the parallels with Islamic criminal law from the same period I find to be remarkable. That is, this all read as very familiar to me because the situation on the sources is similar in that we don't have real-time accounts or court records that we can consult, nor do we have transcripts or audio files of cases like the one that Liz mentioned being argued at the Supreme Court. So it demands then that one read capaciously across all of these traditions, legal and religious sources, literary sources, historical texts, to get a sense of the law and society. The question of and focus on mens rea, or the guilty mind, also arises in Islamic law, albeit with different contours of the discussion. And the legal canons arise with similar salience in Islamic law, or even more so. In the Islamic context, there are entire treatises devoted to collecting these legal canons in just the same time, the 13th and 14th century. That's when those treatises arise. So all of this brings to mind some questions that I'd like to turn to and ask briefly and then ask with a little bit more detail. So the three main questions are these. One, I'd love to know more about Liz's view on interpretation and legal canon. So did the legal canons in your context serve as a kind of interpretive precedent? Second, what about legal theory and values? So usually when we teach criminal law, we start out the course with this case, Regina versus Dudley and Stevens, from none other than the jurisdiction that you're looking at from much farther ahead in time, and just in the last century. And so we're looking at, or in that discussion, we're looking not just at questions of the intent, criminal intent in committing a homicide where two people in a boat and a third who doesn't participate end up killing one of their younger members and eating him in order to avoid starving to death themselves. Is this homicide? Yes, there are questions of intent. There are questions that arise as to the value of human life when we say that it is never permissible to kill someone for the purpose of saving one's own life. But then we're also concerned with the larger justifications for punishment behind treating that episode as a homicide. So I wonder about the ways in which not just mens rea concerns come up in the minds of the jurors, but also what justifications there are for punishment. And then finally, I have a question about institutional structures. On the effect, what is the effect of institutional structures that you describe in the book and the difference between ordinary justice amongst the jurors and royal justice when it comes to questions of mens rea? And so what I want to do is just expand a little bit on those questions now. So taking the first two together, on the question of legal canons, you actually begin the history of mens rea section in your introduction with a legal canon or maxim. And you all will forgive me for butchering the Latin, but I hope you can correct it. Reum non facit nisi mens rea. A person is not to be considered guilty unless he has a guilty intention. Actually traced to Augustine's sermons and others. So I love this beginning. In the course of a look at an extensive array, the very extensive array of literary and theological evidence, you're able to robustly demonstrate that the crime of felony involved deliberation and rationality, the exercise of will, and that a criminal act was wrongful and perhaps essentially wicked. And this comes up in another way in the form of a legal canon through a case. So one case that you talk about is in the 1338 yearbook, and there's a report involving a 13-year-old girl who killed her mistress, presumably, and it presumably resulted in a conviction. That case is discussed with reference to a prior case that resulted in a conviction of a 10-year-old boy, with the justice presiding, citing the maxim, malitia supplet aetatem, malice makes up for age. So notwithstanding, or the conclusion then is that the inclusion of of this case in the yearbook suggests that it's an exception to the rule of non-liability for minors, presumably because they cannot form the type of felonious intent required to be guilty of a crime. But then this maxim is used, malice makes up for age. And so that's the crux of the first question as to whether maxims are functioning in a way as interpretive precedents. So I take it that the justice was not citing the prior case as in a stare decisis binding way, but using guidance from the collection of cases and the absence of statutes to come up with a standard or interpretive standard to figure out or to resolve the case before him. Relatedly, on the question of the justifications of punishment, we typically, those theories of punishment typically are used to justify punishment in cases like this on theories of harm or culpability or expression of values. Does the focus on, or does the juror's conception of mens rea, or the focus on some of these canons and cases like this, help reflect or resolve the question of which larger impetus or theory justified punishment in these cases where the intent was determined to be bad? And then to the last question on the institutional structures. I find it fascinating that you go into this major animus against judging, that judging toward the end of your book, that judging was a fraught business. It pretended to make manifest the judgments of God, although people could never see into the hearts of men, and therefore might subject those who got the decision wrong to damnation. So in England, you describe how it helped tip the balance in favor of the jury system of felony adjudication, and that added to the moral comfort of judges and jurors alike. It removed the determination, or it removed the burden of determining a defendant's guilt from a single judge to being distributed between judge and jury with 12 men or more. And you conclude that both factors, this history of compelled accusation and a precedent of widespread use of juries, ease the adoption of the jury trial, but it also smoothed the operation of felony adjudication during this period. At the same time, judging was a normal part of life. It had to be done. Gangs were rampant. Punishment sometimes had to be meted out. So there seems to be this interplay between enforcement of punishment and avoidance of punishment next to in the ordinary courts. And next to that, you tell us something about royal justice, where royal justice was exemplified by a king standing in for God as the ultimate arbiter or judge, and still responded harshly to crime, yet also pardoned. And so still this interplay between enforcement and avoidance of punishment. And here too, I see a lot of parallels with what's going on, say, in Cairo at this very same time, 13th and 14th century Mamluk Empire. There's an antipathy toward judging. The jurors say judging or to become a judge is to be slaughtered without a knife. But the imperative, or rather, it seems that the solution in England was to distribute the risk of damnation or possible damnation of getting it wrong to judge and jury. In the Islamic world, as I observed in my book, Doubt in Islamic Law, this tension between avoidance and enforcement of punishment ends up getting resolved by this heavy emphasis on creating forms of doubt that tend toward or push toward avoiding punishment in the ordinary courts, even though it, or in large measure, in opposition to the harsh punishment in the royal courts. So that made me wonder then if you could say more about, or what is going on with the institutional structures in your context, the ordinary courts as they function next to the royal courts in determinations of how much responsibility individual judges and jurors have in looking at the guilty mind as a way of determining how to strike that balance between punishment enforcement and avoidance. In the conclusion, you suggest that history is a form of comparative law, that we can gain insights looking at previous English or common law jurisdictions and contemporary common law jurisdictions. And I wholeheartedly agree. In giving many insights throughout your book in earlier jurisdictions in England and comparatively in other jurisdictions, including the Islamic world, you powerfully exemplify just how history is a powerful form of comparative law that lends plenty of insights that need no redemptive impetus on our side. Thank you.
So if you can't hear me in the back row, raise your hand. Good. So let me say something about the historiography of this book. The vast majority of the voluminous records of criminal prosecutions in medieval and early modern England, as Liz tells us, tell us that a given individual was indicted of a crime. Factual details about the crime are given, normally in quite formulaic language. We're told that the defendant appeared before certain royal justices at a particular time and place, and that he or she pleaded normally not guilty and put himself on the jury. In the vast majority of cases, the jury's verdict is reported in a couple of words, guilty or not guilty, and then we're told that the court rendered judgment, normally that the defendant be hanged in the former case and that he go free in the latter. Legal writers on criminal law in the Middle Ages are also singularly unhelpful. They are so unhelpful that the late Professor S.F.C. Milsom was able to say, the miserable history of crime in England, he's speaking of substantive criminal law, can be shortly told. Nothing worthwhile was created. Now, clearly, if we hope to penetrate those unhelpful records and the equally unhelpful legal literature, we need to get behind what lay behind those oracular jury verdicts, to get into what the officials who made the records seem quite deliberately to have treated as a black box. Medieval jurors, however, have left no records of their thoughts, either official or unofficial, and interviewing a man who died in the 13th or 14th century is obviously impossible. Now, there's one member of this panel who would have no trouble conversing with such a man if he could be brought back to life, but that member is not me. So for a long time, the history of medieval and to large extent early modern English criminal law was left to those who wrote encomia on the English criminal trial jury and the blessings of ordered liberty. A few attempts were made to discern what lay at the origins of the English criminal trial jury. That work is summarized in the book. The best of it turns out to be more right than wrong, and Liz offers some important qualifications. Once the criminal trial jury was established, however, we begin the long series of unhelpful records that I described above. Now, one way to get at what was going on in those records would be to use data that the records do provide. We could calculate a percentage rate of convictions. Some of that work has been done, some of it not as carefully as it should have been, but the outcome of all the studies is that the conviction rate, at least by modern standards, was remarkably low in medieval England. I mean, we're used to conviction rates of over 90%. 13th and 14th century criminal trial juries convicted maybe 20%, maybe even less than that of the time. Another way of getting at what's going on in the black box might be to focus on those cases where the records say more. More than 40 years ago, Tom Green focused on verdicts of self-defense. That's something that the jury had to find specifically, because in that case, the defendant was convicted but did not hang. He was automatically pardoned after forfeiting his chattels, but not his land. Self-defense verdicts also tend to be formulaic. The defendant was attacked by the victim. He had his back to the wall. He used no more force than was necessary to resist the attack. But unfortunately, and not surprisingly, in a society without iodine, the victim died when his wound festered. I remember having talked to Green about these cases when he'd just done the work. It turns out there are quite a few of them. And I remember him saying, "I'm not sure that there are that many walls in England." And then he found what turned out to be a smoking gun. A couple of cases where we have both the record of the coroner's inquest and that of the subsequent trial with the resulting verdict of self-defense. And what the coroner's jury had said was not that this was a case of self-defense, but that it was a case of a barroom brawl. The victim got stabbed in the brawl, died of an infected wound. Today, this would not be a case of murder, at least not murder in the first degree, but rather a case of voluntary manslaughter. That distinction, however, was not made in the law until the 16th century. The medieval jury, however, did not think that a man should hang for this, but maybe losing his chattels was an appropriate penalty. Now, starting from Green's work, Liz asked a broader question. Can we make informed guesses about what was going on in the jurors' minds, not just in cases of self-defense, but in all those cases where the jury didn't convict? Legal records and legal literature don't give us an answer or anything like an answer. There is, however, a very large body of evidence about what those in the 13th and 14th centuries thought about criminal and moral responsibility for wrongs. Indeed, those centuries may be regarded as a kind of high point in the development of Western moral thought. That thought can be found in elite academic work in a field that we might call moral theology, work that could not have been known to the typical late medieval juror, but it can also be found in works that might well have filtered down at that level. Sermon literature abounds in this period. Every man and woman in medieval England was supposed to go to confession at least once a year, and manuals were written for priests who heard those confessions. Imaginative literature is full of moral stories, and we have some evidence of moral stories that circulated among those who did not read. Liz has outlined the principal findings of her book. I won't repeat that here. Let me focus on two things that I really like about this book. First, while a majority of the records are, as I described above, singularly unhelpful, not all of them are. It's a huge amount of material to go through, but there's gold in them thar hills. I know of no one who has the mastery of these records that Liz has, and what she has found shows that if we read the more fulsome records in the light of what we know about the background moral ideas, we can see those ideas at work in the records. That was a considerable achievement of a society that in this area has been described as having achieved nothing worthwhile. My second point's more complicated. I began with a question that sounded like a social science question. How do we explain the very low conviction rate in the English medieval criminal records? And the temptation is to think of this book as giving a social science answer to that question. Now, having read the book in various versions, I think that not Liz, but I am asking the wrong question. There are numerous possible answers that a social scientist might suggest for this phenomenon, none of which can be proven granted the nature of the evidence. What we can do, and what Liz does brilliantly, is to approach these records with the mindset of a humanist or certain kinds of anthropologists. What is there in this culture about which we have a considerable amount of evidence that might help us to understand what was going on in the minds of the participants, and particularly the jurors? And rather than making assumptions, as many social scientists do, about human motivation, Liz asks what those motivations might have been in this place at this time. She tells a convincing story. It's a long and complicated story. Everything doesn't head in the same direction, but the bottom line is clear. The low rate of conviction is not surprising at all. But the bottom line is much broader and somewhat different from that. The bottom line is that the criminal process that this society devised makes sense in the light of what that society believed. Final point. Quite a bit of what's in this book was in a dissertation. There were many flashes of insight in the dissertation. I am not sure that I would say that the dissertation was elegantly written. I'm not sure that I've ever read a dissertation that I would say was elegantly written. I'm told that there are such dissertations in mathematics. They're 17 pages long and consist of nothing but equations. I have also read many first monographs which betray their origin in dissertations. This one does not. It's elegant. I urge everyone in the room to read it.
I also urge everyone in the room to read it. It's a lot of fun. I've never read so many accounts of people being killed accidentally or on purpose that I enjoyed so much. I'm the person on the panel who has the questionably useful skill of being able to converse with dead 14th century Englishmen. I've not had the opportunity to exercise that skill directly, but the time travel technology is improving all the time, and so you never know what might happen. I'm also somebody who works, one of not very many people really around the place who works on the religious literature that Liz draws on so brilliantly in her book. The vernacular religious literature written mostly in English, but some of it in what's often called Anglo-Norman French during this period, which provides her with one of her key resources. But reading the book over the last couple of months, I want to start actually in confessional mode. I was reminded that although the phrase mens rea doesn't often cross my mind since I don't work in this building, I spent a good part of my late teens thinking about the term and its implications. So in 1977, which dates my late teens, a rising young QC who I knew well and who was subsequently disgraced, who was also an evangelical Christian, acted as prosecuting counsel in an unusual case of blasphemy brought against the rather niche journal Gay News, which had printed a poem by a man called James Kirkup in which the male narrator performs a sex act on the body of the dead Christ. So the publisher was found guilty, and the case was appealed all the way to the Lords, despite the fact it was only a £500 fine. And the Lords also found him guilty, despite his plea that no blasphemy was intended. There was no mens rea. And I believe this was true, in fact. On rereading the poem 40 years later, it's clearly a work of erotic devotion. And this is, I think, why Gay News published it. It's actually a very good poem. Not relevant, declared 3 of the 5 lords in the case. The relationship between intention and blasphemy in the centuries since blasphemy became a distinct offence under common law in the early modern period has varied, argued the lords, but mens rea had nothing to do with its emergence, and therefore it had nothing to do with the case in hand. In this legal framework, blasphemy inheres in the act, in the publication of a given set of words, not in the mind of the actant. And so the Lords upheld the £500 fine by 3-2, and the case was not taken on by the European Court later on. So I now see that the Lords who made this judgment were interested in the legal principles at issue to do with libel, more than blasphemy as such. But for me at the time, when I was also briefly an evangelical Christian, the case wasn't about law, but about sin, and about whether sin was a matter of what one did or what one meant. And I also see now, and this is my confessional bit, that it was partly my inability to accommodate an understanding of sin in which what one meant wasn't essential, wasn't the heart of it, that led both to my sudden unconversion from this form of religious belief as I turned 20, and to my fascination ever since with the period of Western history in which the concept of intention developed into a vital thought form, that is, between the 12th and the 15th centuries. During this time, intention doesn't just become a key concept in ethical thinking, especially in relation to the practice of sacramental confession, whose influence on 13th and 14th century jurors Liz writes about both speculatively and very brilliantly. Intention also makes its way into other fields, from politics at one end of the spectrum, in considering, for example, the intentions that might inhere in philanthropic institutions, to a literary theory in considering, for example, the authorial intentions that inhere in texts and the reader's obligation to those intentions. So the relationship between an act, its meaning, and the actant's intention was as much a preoccupation to medieval intellectuals as it was to the judges in the Gay News case in the late 1970s. But how far did intention also preoccupy those who were not intellectuals, Liz's jurors? And what did they think about it? So from my own perspective as a medieval religious and literary historian who works primarily on vernacular texts, that is to say, texts directed initially at non-scholarly readers and audiences, this isn't just a question having to do with the history of law, it's a question having to do with the history of Western intellectual culture. And so the very few things I'm going to say about Felony and the Guilt of Mind are to do concern with the way in which Liz here works to break down some of the cruder dichotomies that still tend to structure our account of aspects of Western intellectual culture and have done so since at least the 19th century. So I'm going to just raise three dichotomies and then ask Liz what she thinks about them in the 2 minutes she'll have left, 1 minute she'll have left to talk about this. So one of the key dichotomies here is the dichotomy between the secular and the religious. So the history of law, English law, as a Whig, is a Whig and Protestant history in the way it's always been told, from Maitland onwards in the Victorian period. It's essentially a history of the growth of national and essentially secular systems for adjudicating rights and responsibilities and ordering society. And it's a history that's organized over and against the notion of a kind of baleful dominance of the Church of Rome. And that's why much of the evidence that Liz works on has not seemed to exist from the perspective of, I think, of legal historians, because it's religious and it's obviously Roman in orientation. So Liz's book complicates this massively from its very opening pages by opening in the year 1215, the year of probably the crucial Latin Church Council, the Fourth Lateran Council, and the crucial pair of separate but oddly interconnected ecclesiastical innovations associated with that council. The disappearance of the ordeal as the episcopate withdrew the legitimacy of priestly participation in that event, thus its ability to act as a kind of quasi-sacrament, and thus its ability to appeal to the divine juridical opinion that would come from working out what happened in the ordeal. That's the one thing that happens, and then the other, the institution of confession as a universal sacrament, one which absolutely needed to be written up and to produce the enormous body of Latin and subsequently vernacular literature that it did. So those two things are not actually connected in the Fourth Lateran Council in any kind of easy way. And Liz is bringing them together to show that confession is hypothetically, but very probably, the institution, the ecclesiastical practice that allows jurors to develop the kinds of thinking about intention that she then exfoliates through her discussion of these very brief records. That is simply a wonderful thing to have done, to bring those two things together in that kind of way. It's also wonderful because it allows her to ruminate on sacramental confession down at a fairly low social level, the level of rural household heads, essentially, as an ethically influential practice. So much treatment of this kind of thing understands that it was obviously always pro forma and didn't really inflect people's everyday lives. And one of the things that Liz produces is a lot of everyday life, most in the form of ghastly things happening to small children. But nonetheless, everyday life in which we can see decisions being taken based on these quite complicated ethical frameworks involving what in a sense was still quite a new notion, arguably, of intention. So the second dichotomy that brings us to, that I think Liz challenges, is the broad dichotomy that's often understood in relation to Western culture, right down to the present, certainly down to the mid-20th century, between the learned and the unlearned, or the high and the low, or the learned and the popular, all these different dichotomies. So when social history and the study of ordinary people became a preoccupation of historians in the mid-20th century, particularly with the French group known as the Analystes, the study of popular culture took a turn very rapidly in which the difference between low culture and high culture was emphasized, and I think often radically overemphasized. So the idea that there was a separate, very separate culture that is mostly lost to us and that we shouldn't really worry about what the intellectuals were saying and doing was kind of fundamental here. And it's not surprising that was the case, because this separation is often stressed in medieval sources themselves. One of the great examples Liz gives there is of Chaucer's Friar's Tale from his Canterbury Tales, which turns on the fact that the uneducated summoner who's dragged off to hell at the end of the tale is dragged off to hell because he can't understand the concept of intention. That just simply leads to his damnation. And he's too stupid and low to do that. So that's an available account of the unlearned from the viewpoint of medieval intellectuals like Chaucer. But Liz's book shows how this snobbish view of medieval jurors is quite wrong. I take issue with one, I potentially take issue with one of the ways she frames medieval jurors, in that she does work with a notion of literacy rates and also language learning rates that I think might be too pessimistic. So we still tend to assume that practically everybody in the Middle Ages was illiterate and practically everybody in England knew no French because it was the language of the court. And I think these are views that we might do well to reinvestigate. Pre-modern literacy rates, I think, are going to turn out, if we can ever find out, to be substantially higher than they've been understood to be. But whether or not that's the case, we see these jurors working, not just grasping the importance of the idea of intention, but also grasping the idea that intention is slippery and problematic. It's not at all an idea that you can just go to. You have to adjudicate intention in the individual case, and you can always get it wrong, which is why, under the fear of divine judgment, juries prefer to acquit. So then finally, very quickly, the third dichotomy that I think this raises is the dichotomy that's standard, even if you're not aware of it, between the modern and the thing that isn't the modern, which is the medieval. The modern really requires the medieval, even if you never think about it, to exist as a separate thing. The medieval, as Liz says, is the time of pre-subjectivity, normally, and the modern then becomes the time of hyper-subjectivity. I think that Liz does a lot of work to continue to break down this distinction, partly by showing jurors as rational actors who are thinking in ways that we can understand, albeit in ways that involve assumptions that we would not bring to our own rational thought processes. We probably wouldn't rely, most of us, so heavily on the concept of the transcendent, and we would divide things up into different ways. But Liz simply sympathetically shows us how, in this kind of thought world, you might work in different kinds of ways along those lines. So I guess my two questions, one is, so what are the implications of this for everybody else in the room who's not a medievalist? For me, it's just a fascinating and enthralling book, but I think that's an important question. And then I got a more specific scholarly question, in that I do think that there's a counter-discourse about judging, in which you'll be damned if you don't judge harshly, as well as if you do judge harshly. I think one of the things that could be explored further is the enormous moral pressure that's put on people taking decisions in a culture where there are traditions that push you, ethical traditions which push you very fiercely in opposite directions. So I think the scale of the dilemma for particularly for judges and to some extent for juries, is maybe even higher than you suggest. But thank you for the chance to read this wonderful book. Buy it, everybody, buy it, it's great. Tiny Cambridge print, CUP should not be allowed to do that, but it's wonderful.
Before you go, if you have a class, go. If you don't, hang on. I have a class, so I may walk out in the middle of this, but go ahead.
So thank you to all three of you for your comments, which I'm going to be thinking about for a while and probably following up at some point to go into greater detail. I'll just, in the interest of time, even for those of you who don't have class, I'm assuming you have other obligations, so I'll just speak briefly to each one of you. Intisar, Rob, the justification for punishment question and bringing up Dudley and Stevens reminded me that I did want to sort of emphasize that as much as I think intentionality concerns with mind are operating in the background of felony verdicts, that that use of the sole capital punishment for felony had to play a large role in determining how juries sorted, that there must have been instances in which they felt a person was guilty, but nevertheless, that the punishment wasn't quite right. And with regard to maxims, I would love to talk further. I suspect they played a little bit less of a role actively in terms of what juries were doing, because these maxims are coming out of law reports, they're coming out of treatises like Glanville and Bracton. But similar ideas, I think, are operating in other literary modes. And so maybe there's a way that the maxims, pithy as they are, they get diffused, D-I-F-F, and sent out further into the world by other means. Charlie, I just want to thank you for bringing Tom Green into the picture, because my book would not be here without Tom Green's earlier work in the same sort of legal records. And so I didn't fit him into my 15-minute spiel, but he should be here as a looming presence in the room, looming in the very positive sense. And Nicholas, there's so many things, again, that I'd like to follow up. I'd love to talk more about literacy rates and find out where I should be reading about that issue. But the secular versus religious dichotomy is one that I do feel as though my book, in some ways, the way it's different from earlier histories of crime in medieval England is in bringing in the religious perspective. And sometimes I'm a little nervous about that. Have I gotten this right? Am I reading too much into things? Because in actuality, when you look at the legal records, they do seem very secular. They aren't saying a lot about God. I mean, you'll hear that the juries, said under oath X, Y, and Z, and so we imagine an oath that involves God somehow, but the legal records on the surface do feel very devoid of religious inflection, and so one can see how earlier histories were written without an acknowledgement of the influence, or not a greater acknowledgement of the influence of religious ideas. So I hope I've gotten that right, but it is something that continues to have me a bit nervous. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And sorry to...